Today we are looking at a case from the end of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. Sarah Jane Sutcliffe was born on the 20th of December 1845 in Sussex Street in the city of Sydney in Australia. As a child, her life was not easy. Her father, named Emmanuel, had a troubled past. He was a former convict who had stayed in Australia after he had served his sentence and found work as a miller. Her mother, named Ellen, did her best, often working when she could, but her primary role was caring for the couple's children. Although Sarah's father worked hard, the family never had very much money. Like many young women at the time, Sarah left her parents' home as soon as she was able, and when she was just 19 years old, she married Mr. Charles Edwards, a man who worked as a mariner. This marriage, however, was short-lived, and 6 years later, in 1871, she married again, this time to Mr. John Makin. Like Sarah, John Makin was born in 1845, and he too was the son of a former convict. He was originally from Dapto, which was about 60 miles south of Sydney, but he had come to the city to take advantage of the better employment opportunities. He worked as a brewery drayman, and over the next few years, Sarah gave birth to 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters. But John was not an altogether law-abiding citizen. In November 1881, he was convicted of stealing and sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment. Life was not easy for the Makins. As John got older, he seemed to work far less. He was even described as being far from industrious, and since leaving his job as a brewery drayman, had been in and out of work. At the end of 1891, he was not in paid employment. He had worked for a very short time for a gentleman named Mr. R. Bedford, who had a business in Great Buckingham Street in the Sydney suburb of Redfern. Mr. Bedford was the owner of a livery stable and was also a mail contractor who in the November had hired Mr. Makin as a driver. However, Mr. Bedford concluded that Mr. Makin lacked enthusiasm for the job and soon dismissed him. During the early months of 1892, while residing on Levy Street in Chippendale, John Makin remained out of work and was often seen idling in front of his house. When asked what he was doing by neighbours, Mr. Makin would tell them that he supported himself by private means. It was believed by some that he received £1 a week from a property in Wollongong, which he had inherited from his mother who had passed away in 1890. Many dismissed this story, as despite this so-called income, the family constantly moved from rented house to rented house and obviously struggled financially. They were even described by those who knew them as being miserably poor. But the early 1890s was a difficult period economically for the country. It was characterised by a depression that had significant social repercussions. The crisis had its roots in the 1880s, when Australia experienced a speculative land boom. This was driven by a rapid expansion of credit and a surge in property prices, especially in Melbourne and Sydney. However, by the early 1890s, this had ended, leading to a sharp decline in property values and a wave of bankruptcies. This financial turmoil resulted in widespread unemployment, business closures, and a general sense of economic adversity. Life during the economic depression was marked by severe hardship, especially for the more impoverished families. It had a profound impact on their daily lives, presenting many challenges that made survival a constant struggle. The scarcity of jobs meant that much of the population had no means to cover fundamental necessities, such as food and rent. Housing was a particular issue, with cramped and unsanitary conditions in the poorer areas of the city. People often went hungry, relying on charity for survival. Life was especially difficult for unmarried mothers, who were confronted by a society marked by conservative values and harsh judgments. Pregnancy out of wedlock was viewed as a source of shame, and young women were often subjected to social isolation and stigma. Even their own families would often shun them, leaving many to bear the burden alone. The Makin family had moved many times, but in September 1892 resided at 6 Wells Street in Redfern. The household comprised of John and Sarah Makin, their 2-year-old son Cecil, and daughters Blanche and Florence, who were aged 18 and 17. Two of their sons, William and Percy, had left Sydney and were living in Wollongong, and another daughter named Clarice was working as a domestic servant. Sarah's daughter from her first marriage had already married and had moved away, and another daughter, 11-year-old Daisy, lived apart from the family. On the 11th of October 1892, labourers James Mahoney and Frank Cooney were excavating a trench at 25 Burren Street in MacDonald Town in Sydney. To their horror, they uncovered what they initially thought was a cat's badly decomposed remains, but on further investigation, they realised that what they had found was in fact the body of a baby. The next day they made a second gruesome discovery. This time, they unearthed the body of an infant, buried about a foot deep, about 30 yards from the previous finding. The police were alerted, and both bodies were transported to the South Sydney morgue. A preliminary inquest confirmed that these remains were of a male and female infant. Both were clothed. It was believed that the female had been buried for approximately 6 weeks, while the male had been in the ground for about 3 months. Adding to the mystery, the tenants of the Burren Street house had only been there for 3 weeks prior to the discovery, raising questions about those who had previously lived there. 2 days later, on the 14th of October, another decomposed male infant was found in an empty lot on Zamia Street in Redfern. The pathologists examined the body, but the advanced state of decomposition rendered it impossible to ascertain the cause of death, and the question as to whether the child had been born alive remained undetermined. Senior Constable Joyce was assigned to track down the previous occupants of 25 Burren Street, and soon uncovered that the Makin family had resided there for 7 weeks, between the 29th of June and the 16th of August 1892, before they relocated to Wells Street. Without delay, he paid them a visit. While inspecting their new residence and surroundings, he noticed signs of recently disturbed earth. Upon digging in the ground, he found nothing of note, but he harboured suspicions that the body discovered in Zamia Street might have been removed from the Wells Street location and reburied. Senior Constable Joyce also learned that during this period, Sarah Makin had advertised her services as a midwife. Mr. and Mrs. Makin were apprehended, but they denied that they knew anything about the deaths. On the 26th of October, an inquest was held at the Coroner's Court at Chancery Square. Testimonies were provided by the workmen who had discovered the bodies, the doctors who had conducted the autopsies, Senior Constable Joyce, and several people who lived in the area. The medical evidence indicated that of the first 2 bodies found, the female baby may have been stillborn, while the male was estimated to have been between 5 and 8 months old, having been deceased for between 3 and 6 months. On the final day of the inquest, key witnesses took the stand, including Mr. and Mrs. Makin and 2 of their daughters, Blanche and Florence. Sarah Makin revealed that shortly after moving into the MacDonald townhouse in June 1892, she had assumed the role of a wet nurse for a female child who was approximately 2 weeks old, for which she was paid a weekly sum of 10 shillings. However, she recounted that in mid-August, the child's mother reclaimed her, stating her intention to relocate to Melbourne. Mrs. Makin stressed that this particular child had been the only one that she had taken in, a statement that was corroborated by her husband and children. In his summing up, City Coroner John Waugh acknowledged that the case was surrounded by suspicion. He said that it was clear that the bodies had been discreetly placed where they had been found, but after a brief deliberation, the jury returned an open verdict. The evidence presented did not offer sufficient insight into how the 3 infants had died. The mystery deepened in the following weeks, when on the 2nd of November, Senior Constable James Joyce and Constable Alexander Brown initiated an excavation at the yard in Burren Street. But here they made another chilling discovery: 5 more infant bodies, buried in shallow graves in the backyard. John and Sarah Makin were arrested, along with their daughters Blanche and Florence. They were then taken to the Newtown police station. Blanche revealed that she remembered her mother caring for 3 infants simultaneously, This conflicted with her earlier statement, where she had claimed that her mother had only cared for one child. Blanche explained that her parent had instructed her to deny knowledge of any other children being in the house. Police believe that one of the deceased babies was named Mignonette Bottomley, the illegitimate child of Mr. Horace Bottomley and Miss Minnie Davis, who had been born on the 10th of June 1892. The couple came forward to tell the police a harrowing tale. They said that faced with difficult circumstances, they had placed an advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 21st of June, seeking a kind-hearted person to adopt their child. Mr. John Makin, using the alias Bert, answered the advert. They said that he visited them and agreed to take the baby for a fee of 10 shillings a week, reassuring them that they could visit their child whenever they wished. In good faith, they left the baby and some clothing with the Makin family at their residence on George Street in Redfern. However, they went on to say that soon after, the Makins moved to Burren Street in MacDonaldtown, though they were able to continue to visit and pay the weekly fee. During one visit, they said that they had noticed a printed card that read, "Mrs. Makin, ladies' nurse and qualified midwife." They confronted Mrs. Makin, who admitted that she had not disclosed to them her real name. Miss Davis then told the officer that as weeks went by, their concerns grew. Then suddenly, the Makins informed them that their baby had a cold, and soon after, that her health had taken a severe turn. John Makin had promised to take her to the doctor, but a day or so later, he sent a telegram claiming the child had passed away. Miss Davis said that on the 4th of August, she and Mr. Bottomley went to the Makin residence with flowers, as they wanted to view their daughter for one last time. The baby was laid out on a board, dressed in a long white gown. She told of how John Makin looked at them and said, "Perhaps it's better that it die." She tearfully told the officer that his words sent shivers down her spine. Miss Davis added that when she asked about the cause of death, Mr. Makin stated that she had wasted away and assured her that he would obtain a doctor's certificate. A coffin had apparently been ordered, and he asked her and Mr. Bottomley for £2 to cover the burial costs. Following this statement, John, Sarah, Blanche and Florence Makin were arrested and charged with causing the death of the child. Investigators then declared their intention to dig up the yards of various houses that the Makin family had occupied during the past 4 years. Senior Constable Joyce suspected that during this period, the Makins had been involved in what was then called baby farming. Baby farming was a grim practice that had emerged in the 19th and early 20th centuries, primarily in urban areas. It involved the temporary care of infants, often born out of wedlock or to parents facing dire circumstances. Tragically, many of these so-called baby farmers operated under limited regulation, and their intentions are often more financial gain than the welfare of the children. As a result, countless infants placed in the care suffered neglect, malnourishment, and even death. By mid-November, yards in Botany Street, East Street, and Kettle Street had all been searched, although no discoveries were made. Subsequent searches were planned for the other properties where it was known that the Makins had lived. The case had captivated public attention. It had been reported in all of the newspapers and was evolving into one of the most mysterious and disturbing criminal investigations in Sydney's history. The shadow of suspicion loomed over the Makin family as the city grappled with the enigma of the infant bodies and the unanswered questions surrounding their deaths. As the police investigated further, the identities of more of these poor deceased little souls came to light. Agnes Ward, a domestic servant, told them that she had given birth on the 12th of February 1891 and had arranged for John and Sarah Makin to adopt her child, who she had named Charles. She said that she had agreed to pay them £5. Claire Risby, another servant girl, told officers that her baby daughter had been born on the 15th of April and she too had paid £5 to the Makins to adopt her, only they told her that her name was McLachlan. Another domestic servant, named Mary Stacey, had answered an ad for a family looking for a baby and in June 1891, the Makins, posing as a Ray family, offered to look after her baby if she paid them a fee of £3. Agnes Todd, who also worked in domestic service, had given birth to a baby girl who she named Elise in December 1891. A few months later, she had agreed to pay Mr. John Makin £3 to take the child. She said that he collected the baby from a lady named Mrs. Sutherland, who had previously been looking after her. Miss Todd added that Mr. Makin gave an address of 109 George Street in Redfern. In May 1892, Amber Murray, who at the time was 18 years old, gave birth to a baby boy, who she named Horace. She told the police that on the 25th of June, she posted an advert in the Sydney Morning Herald, seeking a motherly person to adopt her child, offering to pay a small premium. She went on to say that this advert was answered by Mr. and Mrs. Makin, who used as pseudonym Mr. and Mrs. Hill. They contacted her, expressing their willingness to adopt the child for a fee of £3 and assured her that they could provide the baby with a mother's love and attention. When the police asked if a couple had left an address, she replied that they had, and it was 109 George Street in Redfern. The police knew that following this, the Makins had swiftly relocated to Burren Street in the MacDonald Town area of Sydney. Law enforcement conducted searches at the Makins' former residences and discovered the bodies of more infants. Prosecutors alleged that the Makin family's motive was financial gain, as they agreed to look after babies in exchange for childcare payments, but resorted to heinous acts in order to deceive the parents and continue receiving money. When the police showed Miss Amber Murray the clothes that one of the babies had been wearing, she confirmed that they had belonged to her son. Following examinations by the city coroner, John and Sarah Makin faced charges for causing the death of Horace Murray, the illegitimate male child of Miss Amber Murray, on or around the 27th of June 1892, and were committed to stand trial at the Central Criminal Court. Additionally, they were charged with causing the death of Mignonette Bottomley, the illegitimate daughter of Horace Bottomley and Minnie Davis, who was believed to have died around the end of July or the beginning of August 1892. The case had already caused a sensation in Sydney, even before the trial had begun. It commenced on the 6th of March 1893 and was presided over by Justice Stephen. Mr. and Mrs. Makin were charged with the felonious and malicious murder of Amber Murray's illegitimate male child and the illegitimate female child of Horace Bottomley and Minnie Davis. From the start, this was a complex and emotionally charged case. The charges stemmed from events that had transpired between June and August of 1892 in Redfern, a suburb of Sydney. The second charge was essentially a contingency set in place to address potential issues related to the child's identity. The Makins pleaded not guilty to both charges and were represented by attorney Thomas Williamson. The trial itself was highly dramatic. John Makin displayed a disinterested attitude, crossing his legs and folding his arms as he sat in the dock during the Crown Prosecutor's address and the witnesses' testimonies. Sarah Makin, on the other hand, concealed her face with a handkerchief throughout the proceedings. Amber Murray was a key witness. She detailed the sequence of events leading to her handing over her infant son to the Makins. She made a poignant identification, recognising the clothing found on the remains of the child as the same clothing her son had been wearing when she entrusted him to the Makins. Notably, the gown was one that she had personally made for him, and the shirt had been given to her for the baby. On the second day of the trial, Edward Jordan, a horse trainer who had been incarcerated alongside John Makin at the Newtown police station, testified that Mr. Makin had told him that he had done away with 8 babies. He also said that Mr. Makin had boasted that no doctor could ever prove he had poisoned any of them, as he had never acquired any chemicals from a chemist. The Crown's case, which was led by prosecutor Patrick Healy, concluded on the third day. However, the Makins chose not to make a statement or present any evidence in their defence. Following this, the jury began deliberations. However, on the first night, they were unable to reach a verdict. The jury reconvened on the 9th of March 1893, and eventually a unanimous verdict was reached. They found the defendants, Mr. John and Mrs. Sarah Makin, guilty of murdering little Horace Murray, but in a strange twist. They strongly recommended mercy for Sarah Makin. Justice Stephen delayed sentencing, waiting for a full court decision regarding the admissibility of certain evidence which had been raised by the defence. The appeal to the full bench of the Supreme Court occurred on the 23rd of March 1893. It was based on several grounds, but mainly regarding the evidence relating to the discovery of the bodies and the deaths of the infants. The full bench took a week to deliberate before delivering their verdict, which upheld the convictions. The Makins then returned to the Central Criminal Court for sentencing by Justice Stephen. He declared that they had been engaged in baby farming in its worst phase and its most hideous and revolting aspect. He said that the ghastly evidence from the houses in which they lived testified that they were carrying on this nefarious and hellish trade, destroying the lives of those infants for the sake of gain. At the conclusion of his address, the judge sentenced both prisoners to execution by hanging. In the case of Sarah Makin, he added that he would forward the recommendation of mercy to the executive. As the judge said his final words, Sarah Makin collapsed, and as two constables carried her from court, she cried out, "Oh my babies, oh my babies." As they returned to prison, the family of John and Sarah Makin made a plea for clemency, reaching out to the Governor of New South Wales. Subsequently, Sarah Makin's death sentence was changed to life imprisonment, but her husband's appeal was denied, as it was agreed that the law should take its course. John Makin was executed by hanging on the 15th of August 1893 at Darlinghurst Jail. He faced his fate with resignation, having placed little hope in the appeals for a reprieve. Sarah Makin worked while in prison and held various positions within the correctional system, including a hospital attendant. However, her health deteriorated, so in 1911, after serving 18 and a half years for her crimes, she was quietly and anonymously released. She spent the rest of her life with her family and passed away on the 13th of September 1918 at the age of 72. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.